As those fraud charges were laid, several groups backed the finance minister, many of them from civil society. Our reporter Thulasizwe Simelane spoke to social commentator Pinky Khoabane and Dale Mckinley from the Right2Know campaign on the role of civil society in contemporary South Africa.
So it seems Pravin Gordhan, Opa Magashula and Ivan Pillay will not be going to court as originally planned on Wednesday. This of course throws out many of the plans that many South Africans, including those in civil society, had for Wednesday, because they had marked that particular day as the day when civil society and ordinary South Africans would rise up and actually make their voices heard about how things are being conducted, particularly around this issue. But civil society activism is not a new thing in South Africa. You go back to the fight against apartheid. You had great organizations such as the United Democratic Front, the UDF, of course. There was an organization that included more than 600 civil society organizations of various persuasions and various political backgrounds that were fighting against apartheid. And then you had, of course, in the early years of our democracy, organizations such as the Treatment Action Campaign that were campaigning. You had the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, Anti-Privatization Forum. But it seems today's civil society activism involves a lot of court action, a lot of litigation, and you occasionally see, of course, days such as what is planned for Wednesday that is being dubbed a National Day of Action. Let's reflect then on the role of civil society in democratic South Africa. We are here at Constitution Hill, and I'm joined by Pinky Khoabane and I'm joined by Dale Mckinley. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Let's start with a broad question. How alive is civil society activism in South Africa, Pinky?
I mean, we have so many organizations, civil society groups today, but I just want to go back to what you were saying, that it's more about litigation these days. I think it's probably more about what the media, concentrates on. There are many civil society groups, and they're doing lots of work. And I mean, we know in issues of human rights, issues of education, water, and general social development issues and so forth. So we have lots that's going on. It's just that the media love
the big headline.
Big headlines.
Yeah.
I think so.
Do you agree, Dale? There are many struggles playing themselves
Absolutely,
out?
and this has been going on for 22 years. We have a very lively and vibrant civil society. Sometimes it, makes victories, other times it's defeated. But it's there, and it's there from the community level all the way up to the national level. And it deals with the big issues and the small ones. I agree with Pinky that sometimes all of those small little things that are going on at the local level don't get really paid much attention to. So for example, we have the shack dwellers movement, which is expanding all across the country, and it's used both the legal as well as mobilizational tactics. So I think what we have, though, is a weakness in bringing that civil society together. I think oftentimes we're sectoralized as civil society. We work in our own little sectors, and I think that's where the challenge really is. I think that the politics is there, the energy is there, and certainly some of the anger and frustration is definitely there.
Because as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking about all the marches that I used to see you attending in the mid-90s, Dale, over issues such as privatization and the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee. What do you say to someone who says it's no longer really the same, that you used to have ratepayers associations, and they were able, the UDF, for example, was able to do that campaign of 1 million signatures against that tricameral arrangement of apartheid, and you would have bus boycotts and consumer boycotts, and they would be very successful. Today, if civil society organizations, let's restrict it to the big national issues. If you say to people, let's come out and march on a big national issue, it usually doesn't attract that much support.
Well, I think that first of all, we are in a very different context. Anti-apartheid movements were an illegitimate, undemocratic, authoritarian government that wanted to overthrow that government. Here we're talking about, irrespective of all the problems we have a democracy. We have fundamental changes that have taken place, and therefore a lot of contestation politically, as opposed to in the anti-apartheid era. So civil society is not one big homogenous group. There are many different parts. I could say there's progressive ones, there's more conservative, there's business, there's unions, and so forth. So yes, it's much more difficult to have large-scale mobilizations. But I don't think that's necessarily what we always need, is these large-scale mobilizations. I think that what we need is active civil society where it is taking place, whether at the local level, and that oftentimes is simply not, as I said, paid attention to, but it's creating victories. And oftentimes, let me just say this, when you don't see so many marches, civil society has had many different successes. So there's no longer need to march on certain things. We shifted, and that's great because it makes our democracy dynamic.
I actually think there is that aspect, but there's also a new relationship that civil society now has with government. And it has to do with the fact that, yes, we are in a democratic state at the moment. But this is a fundamentally unhealthy relationship. It's called unhealthy because civil society ought to be political, out there fighting, activism. So these days we find, there's more dialogue between government and civil society. And therefore that's why we don't have to be, there isn't that aggression or tension that we used to have in the past. It creates a new dynamic in the sense that civil society doesn't always hold the powerful as much as they should be.
They don't always hold them to account, as they used to.
Yes, because there's now this shift in terms of the relationship. There are open doors for dialogue, for communication, and but there's a fundamentally concerning relationship between civil society and corporates. They don't hold them to account as much as they should.
The private sector, that is.
The private sector, yes.
Dale?
Well, I wanted to say that there's again, it's what's being paid attention to and what's not. And let's be honest, a lot of the issues that the media cover speak to a middle and upper middle class constituency. So what we have is we have huge amounts of communities that are going after the mines and their environmental destruction, for example. We've got a large range of communities of civil society going after access to information where it counts on private sector and corruption and white collar fraud. We just don't hear about it oftentimes. We have a focus, civil society versus the state, in a way, and this is the main thing, and yet it's much more complex and much more sophisticated than that. And let me just say this, is that one of the reasons why civil society, I would argue, has become more engaged and become more active is precisely because many of those spaces that we did have in the 90s are being shut down. So yes, we do have dialogue, but if you ask most communities why are they protesting, why are we the protest capital of the world, they'll tell you because we're going out on the streets, because the ward committee is captured, because all of those things are not
Let's focus a bit on the litigation aspect of things. Is it something for us to celebrate that many of the misdeeds of various actors in the state have been corrected in the courts, largely due to action by civil society? Or do we need to lament this and say, we have a state that really doesn't always understand what it's meant to be doing, or perhaps chooses to neglect what it's supposed to be doing? Pinky?
I think, it's one of those issues where civil society is there, it's a political instrument to make changes. So when they find themselves having to go to court, that in itself is a concern, Going back to just this issue of Abrams and the NPA, it is, when I came here I was thinking, should we be really concerned that the civil society is putting pressure and influencing prosecutions?
Yes.
That is concerning. But when you then hear flip-flop within that same time when you're thinking there's something not quite right, that civil society or anybody can influence a prosecution. If the man is wrong, he's not above the law, he must go to court. And then you hear civil society saying, no, we're going to march and influence it. But at the same time, you hear Abrams just a couple of minutes ago telling us he's withdrawing. So it's such a concern in the sense that where are we really as a society?
Does it talk to our broken politics, Dale, that civil society and ordinary South Africans feel that we cannot trust the institutions such as the NPA to make a decision as guided by the Constitution and the laws that govern them, and therefore we don't need to really be monitoring them, but we need to be putting pressure? Does it talk to a broken politics?
I think that there is definitely a broken politics, and the reason why it's broken is because the reason why most civil society organizations go to court is not because they like to go to court, it's because somebody's breaking the law. or they're not implementing the law. And you see, I don't understand this controversy personally, because civil society has many tools in its toolbox. We have a constitution. This is the constitution. If the constitution is being violated, we have a duty as civil society to try to make sure that that is not the case. The courts is one element of that. And we have had many victories where this constitutional court right here has pushed back, people who want to abuse the law, who want to cut corners and everything. That's important. It's not the only thing. But yes, what it does point to is that we have a political class and a corporate class that thinks they can do pretty much what they want to do. And the other problem is that they will string out litigation because they have endless amounts of funds. So it's an uneven battle. So that's why civil society has to use all the tools in its toolbox.
Let's go for the big one. When you see action by civil society organizations, specific ones, if you talk about Helen Suzman Foundation, Freedom Under Law, and those kind of organizations, you usually hear the counter argument that sort of suggests that there's a certain agenda that is at play that is not really about upholding the constitutional dispensation that we have in South Africa. Even some others actually take it further to even say, they're serving the interests of the Ruperts, as this argument was being framed in this particular case of Pravin Gordhan. How much credence do you give to that, Pinky?
I mean, look, we know that there are many civil society groups who do fantastic work, and they do it in various. Dale is more affair with that. They do it in many areas, but we also know there are civil society groups, NGOs, which have an agenda. They are sponsored by corporates, they are sponsored by foreign governments. They have a specific agenda, and one has to actually look and say, who are the funders of these people, and why are they going after a particular issue? I mean, the Pravin Gordhan with the Helen Suzman. I mean, when you look at some of the funders there, even his Investec, where his daughter works, is a funder. So, you begin to say, well, who are these people? Who are the funders behind all of this? But when you see the outcome, as we've had just a couple of minutes ago, you ask yourself, does it even matter? But there are those.
There's always that question of the agenda, Dale.
Listen, I think that this is a red herring. When the Minister of State Security got in Parliament and asked if said that the right to know was funded by foreign spy agencies and was attempting to undermine the sovereignty because we were asking critical questions about the implementation, we turned around and said, fine, Minister, you can see everybody who funds the right to know. What we want to know is who funds the ANC. We want to know where. If we want to talk about corporate capture, if we want to talk about people who have relationships, we could talk about a whole range of money that's coming into the political. Why is it that the political parties have failed in 22 years to pass legislation on political party funding? So the question is not just civil society. Of course, everybody has got an agenda. The question is what kind of agenda. But we cannot point fingers at different people simply because we disagree with them. One of the crises of a broken system is when we're not willing to listen to opposing views, and we're not willing to engage in that debate, and we want to shut it down simply because it differs from what we think of. And so, of course, we're going to have different class interests. Of course, there's going to be different ideological battles. This is the nature of a democracy. And so it should be welcomed that we have these things. But as far as investigating things, let's be equal across the board. If we're going to look at the Helen Suzman Foundation and where they get their funding, which I'm sure you can find on their website, let's also get the funding from where the politicians get their funding and where the political parties do as well.
I'm running out of time. Yes, very quickly.
But this conversation is about civil society.
Yes. Not about political party funding.
You're talking about civil society and focusing on that and their funding.
They should be accountable as well.
They should be scrutinized like everybody else.
Right.
The point I was trying to make is that the vast majority of civil society organizations are completely transparent. There is a discourse that gets taken up without the facts. So, for example, the right to know. Anybody can go and find out exactly where anything comes from and where these things, and everything is there, including the audited statements and everything else.
Running out of time. Yeah. Very quickly, this week was marked to be a very historic week in terms of citizen activism. You remember the whole lament about how we don't have an active citizenry. Are we reaching a point, because of the contemporary developments and the almost protracted crisis after crisis that we see, are we reaching a point where the citizen has had enough and will join hands with civil society in action to defend this democracy?
Well, I don't know that we are. You started off by saying we don't see the big marches that we used to have. But today it's a completely different world. You don't actually have to march. There's a whole citizenry on things like social media. So there's a completely different way of protest. And we see it happening a lot on social media, on either side of the discourse, actually. Yeah, so it's good.
Yeah. Dale?
Absolutely. I think that, as I said, I think we've got a vibrant civil society, but it's a contested civil society. And I think that what we're seeing is we're going through a period in our history right now where those contestations are coming to the surface. Not just, in terms of the big questions, but within civil society itself. So what you're going to find in that context is a whole range of different kinds of agendas and a whole range of different kinds of focuses. And that is okay. I don't think we should expect that 22 years into democracy, we're going to have a mass movement that is trying to overthrow the state. So I think in that context, we should welcome all of these different aspects of civil society. There is improvements that need to happen. There's questioning that needs to happen, yes. But as long as it's there, as long as it's speaking out, and as long as it's vibrant, it means our democracy is working.
Dale, on that note, let's close it. I like what you're saying, a vibrant civil society, but a contested civil society, as attested to by this very brief discussion we've had. The issues are many, there are plenty. They cover a whole range of issues, and we will talk until the sun sets, and we will not be able to cover all the issues. For now, it's back to you in the studio.